In late 1915, World War I was being fought in the trenches of mainland Europe. Britain, France, and Russia were allied against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. The war in Europe was stagnating, but Britain urgently needed a strategy as to how to divide the Ottoman Empire with France, should the Allies be victorious. The Prime Minister turned to a young British politician called Sir Mark Sykes, who had cast himself as the government's advisor on the Middle East.
The Ottoman Empire is assailed by misfortune, crippled by myriad vices, and the prey of alien greed, ambition, and timidity. Englishmen may have ideas, but they are unable to take any steps to overturn the regime and free the peoples under its power.
By the 3rd of January 1916, he and the French lawyer turned diplomat François-Georges Picot would have negotiated the terms of a secret agreement.
In 2 words, I foresee a protectorate regime which uses the local traditions and customs to establish different regimes in the 4 provinces of Syria. Lebanon, a Lebanon enlarged by the annexation of Beirut, Tripoli, the Bekaa, and serving as a model of what is necessary to achieve with the indigenous elements in Palestine, Damascus, and Galilee.
These 2 men devised a plan that would not only divide the spoils of the declining Ottoman Empire between the 2 European powers, but would draw lines in the sand that would ultimately influence the shape of the Middle East for the next century. Istanbul, capital of an Ottoman empire that had stood for 6 centuries. It spanned the 3 continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Its peak had been in the 16th century.
ابتداء من القرن السادس عشر بدأ في هناك الدقية الروسية موسكو تتوسع وتتحول تدريجيا إلى دولة بالغة الأهمية ثم إلى إمبراطورية كبيرة جدا، وأصبحت تشكل قلق كبير على الحزام العثماني في الشمال. طبعا كان هناك أيضا النمسا، بريطانيا وفرنسا ابتداء من القرن الثامن عشر بدأت تصعد هذه القوى باعتبارها قوى ذات قدرات عالمية في البحار ومستعمرات ما خلف البحار.
في القرن الثامن عشر بدأت هزيمات للدولة العثمانية، وبدأت الدولة هناك خلل خاصة في الصناعة، لأن الدولة العثمانية لم تكن الدولة الصناعية، كانت دولة الزراعية وتجارة. ما استطاعت أن تفهم هذه التطورات في أوروبا، خاصة التطور الثورة الصناعية.
هذا التغيير في ميزان القوى هو الذي بدأ في حصار الدولة العثمانية وفي دفع الدولة العثمانية في عدة مناطق، سواء في الجزائر ثم بعد ذلك في مصر إلى الخلف. ليس هناك انحطاط عثماني كما كان يتصوره البعض، ولكن حصل تدريجيا هناك تغير كبير في ميزان القوى في العالم دفع الدولة العثمانية إلى الخلف.
The Ottoman Empire began receding in the 19th century. In 1830, it lost Algeria to France, while Egypt gradually came under British rule, which then expanded into the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs of Mesopotamia, Greater Syria, and the Hijaz remained part of the Ottoman Empire, which was undergoing its own changes.
القرن التاسع عشر بدأت الحداثة بدأ دخول الأفكار الأوروبية والديمقراطية أو المجلس إلى داخل الدولة العثمانية في عهد عبد الحميد الثاني، أول مجلس الموجود، وبعد ذلك في بداية القرن العشرين مجلس الثاني. هناك كل الممثلي الشعوب موجودة من العالم العربي والأقطار العربية، ممثلين من لبنان وشام ومصر كانوا موجودين.
In 1908, the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid II and restored the 1876 constitution. This reduced tension at the top of Ottoman politics, but also created anxiety among Arab groups in the empire.
كان لهذه المجموعة ميول ديكتاتورية، كان لهذه المجموعة ميول إثنية وعرقية، أي يعني كانوا ممكن الواحد يعتبرهم قوميين أتراك، أو على الأقل كان عندهم نزعات قومية تركية، وهذا كان مستحيل دمج هذه الأفكار بدولة ذات قوميات متعددة.
كأنه كان في هناك شعور لدى قادة الاتحاد والترقي أن سيطرة الدولة المركزية ليست كافية، أنه ينبغي تعزيز سيطرة الدولة وقدرات الدولة، بمعنى ينبغي تعزيز مركزة الدولة. هذا الذي أعطى انطباع بأنه لدى هذه الحكومة توجهات تتريكية، أنه إذا كان في مراسلات المحاكم باللغة العربية ألغيت مراسلات المحاكم باللغة العربية وأدخلت اللغة التركية، لأنه هذا هو مقتضيات المركز.
By 1914, you could really say that for those Arabs who were engaged in identity politics, what they aspired to was a better deal for the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire. This brand of politics is known as Arabism. And Arabists were really thinking in terms of imitating the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a kind of Arab-Turkish dual monarchy in the Ottoman Empire. But were very concerned not to exit the Ottoman umbrella for fear that were the Arabs ever to make a bid for independence, they would be immediately at risk of European domination.
The Ottomans suffered a major defeat in 1912 at the hands of Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro in the First Balkan War. They lost the bulk of their European territories, but the defeat did initially ease the relationship between the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks in government.
العرب أيضا تأثروا بصفتهم مواطنين عثمانيين بالنتائج المؤلمة لحرب البلقان، والدولة العثمانية الآن أصبحت أكثر حرصا على وحدة ما تبقى من ولاياتها والتفاف عناصر الدولة المختلفة حول الدولة، وبدأ التوتر يتراجع. ولكن طبعا في العامين الأولين من الحرب العالمية الأولى عاد التوتر من جديد.
The First World War started at the end of July 1914. Britain, France, and Russia fought the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. Shortly after, the Ottomans opted to support Germany.
الخيار العثماني الحقيقي الأول كان هو الاصطفاف إلى جانب بريطانيا وفرنسا وروسيا، ولكن الروس بشكل أساسي كان لهم يعني أهداف توسع في منطقة المضايق، ولم يكونوا حريصين على يكونوا الطرف العثماني طرف شريك لهم.
روسيا خاضت الحروب ضد الأتراك 12 حربا على مدى 3 قرون، واستولت على القريم وأزاحت السيطرة العثمانية من المناطق الجنوبية الحالية لروسيا، من كوكاس، من بلقان، وهذا كان صراع جيوبوليتيكي يعني لفترة طويلة جدا. والمصالح الإمبريالية الروسية كانت تقتضي امتلاك الممرات يعني الطريق السهل من البحر الأسود إلى البحر الأبيض المتوسط إلى أوروبا.
الروس دوما هذا الهدف الأساسي كان الوصول إلى المياه الدافئة، وإمبراطورية مثل الإمبراطورية القيصرية الروسية وهي قارة بحد ذاتها لم يكن عندها المنافذ المطلوبة، كانت تريد، ومن هنا المرور إن كان عبر الدردنيل أو عبر البوسفور هو المفتاح نحو المياه الدافئة.
In February 1915, frustrated by the stagnating war in Europe, the British opened an eastern front against the Ottomans on the Dardanelles Strait. They imagined the Ottoman army as weak and easier to defeat, as a way of taking on Germany and ending the war. Russia, however, was more concerned about its use of Ottoman waterways, so the Russians asked Britain and France to sign an agreement to guarantee their own share of the spoils after the war.
The Russians were keen to seize more as cultural capital, as a sort of restoration of Orthodox Christianity after 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. And so with the outbreak of the First World War, and on the eve of the Gallipoli invasion, the Russians wanted to secure their allies' commitment to granting Istanbul and the Straits to the Russian Empire. And this becomes an exchange of documents known as the Constantinople Agreement, concluded between March and April 1915.
Britain, France, and Russia entered into the Constantinople Agreement, which granted the Russians certain Ottoman territories and waterways. However, this agreement paved the way for another secret deal, as London and Paris started to plot exactly what they wanted from a region that was gaining strategic significance in the coming age of oil.
You can really say that Britain entered the war without any clear territorial ambitions in Arab territory. They could not, at the stage of the Constantinople Agreement, identify one place that they wished to add to their empire, but they reserved the right to do so as soon as they'd worked out what their priorities were. And so, in a sense, the Constantinople Agreement really is the first of the wartime partition agreements that will begin to shape the way in which the Arab provinces will be carved up, primarily between Britain and France, since Russia's interests lay mostly in Turkish territories.
So, in very British fashion, the British created a committee called the de Bunsen Committee, and its remit was to look into the options for Britain, so that when the time for negotiations with the French came up, the British would be well prepared and know what they wanted. And this is actually something that the British did throughout the war and right to the end of the war.
So in April 1915, the British set up a committee headed by the diplomat Maurice de Bunsen to define their interests in the Ottoman territories. It made certain assumptions about what its ally France would expect from any potential deal.
اللجنة عملت في ضوء الاعتقاد السائد في لندن في ذلك الوقت أن الفرنسيين يريدون الليفانت بمعنى سوريا الكبرى. إن الفرنسيين كانوا يقولون إنه إحنا من أيام الحرب الصليبية إحنا لنا مصالح في هذه المنطقة، إحنا لنا دور تاريخي في هذه المنطقة، إحنا لنا علاقات وثيقة بهذه المنطقة، وإحنا نريد هذه المنطقة.
Britain's interests were most likely to be in completing its imperium in the Persian Gulf by securing the territories of the provinces of Basra and Baghdad, linked as they were to Persian oil fields in Abadan Island in the Shatt al-Arab, and nicely completing a dominion that stretched right around the Arab coastline of the Persian Gulf, which had been in place since the 1820s.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. So the de Bunsen Committee was set up, and its youngest, most junior and most carefree member was Mark Sykes, who was Kitchener's military assistant. Kitchener was the Secretary of State for War, and he delegated the job of sitting on the committee to Sykes.
Mark Sykes had been born into a wealthy family in Yorkshire, in the north of England in 1879. He studied at Cambridge University and was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament in 1911. He liked to give the impression of being an expert on the Middle East based on his travel in the region. But he was not quite the authority, as it was sometimes assumed. He presented the De Bunsen Committee with his vision of a new Near East.
This region has riches, I tell you, and this will be our opportunity.
Sykes had come up himself with a different plan, which was something completely different and much more old-fashioned. And that was to create a cordon across the Middle East. So he was planning to divide the Middle East between France and Britain and create a belt of English-controlled country that stretched across from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains on the Iranian frontier, and acted essentially as a frontier that Britain could control and keep other people away from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf.
To seize control over it all.
That was rejected by the De Bunsen
I wish to have
Committee. The
all this.
older, wiser heads said, no, that won't work.
You're out of your mind.
In July 1915, the De Bunsen Committee recommended dividing the Ottoman Empire into several provinces over which Britain would seek influence rather than exercise direct control. But when Sykes was sent to the Middle East and India, he began to revert to his original idea of a British cordon from the Mediterranean to Iraq.
So, Sir Mark, from your knowledge of the Arab question, where would you say that allegiance lies? Between us and the French, I mean?
Practically all Arabs are pro-English. Not exactly anti-French, but frightened of financial exploitation, and they are frightened of French colonial methods.
But there are many Christians in Syria, in the Lebanon in particular. How do they feel?
The Christians are as afraid at the bottom of their hearts as the Muslims.
And only in Syria?
That feeling, sir, is prevalent everywhere. Because they know what the French do, that feeling pretty well runs all through. There's the French Nationalist Party, which is sentimental, still harking back to the Crusades.
So Sykes returned, and as these currents sort of started to come together, he was called into Downing Street at the end of the year, on the 16th of December 1915. And then he must have gone with a map as well, because he got into the meeting with the cabinet, the Prime Minister and his chief ministers sitting round the cabinet table in Downing Street.
I believe they fear an Arab caliphate, which is an independent state, the common language of the Arabs of Tunis, Algeria, and Morocco.
Which, of course, they control entirely.
The French nationalists believe that if the Allies win, they want Syria, Palestine, and North Mesopotamia.
Sykes appeared to be someone who was very knowledgeable, and in fact, in that cabinet meeting that he went to in December 1915, the result of the cabinet meeting was that one of the cabinet ministers who was there believed that he could speak Arabic and Turkish, but in fact he could speak neither language. So he dotted his speech with Arabic phrases, that sort of thing, to give himself the appearance of being an expert, when in fact he was more of a gifted amateur.
What do you think we should do, Sir Mark?
I think to counteract the French war aims, we require diplomacy.
What do you think diplomacy will achieve with the French, Sir Mark?
I don't want to make any suggestions except on very general lines. But I feel we ought to settle with France as soon as possible and get a definite understanding about Syria.
What sort of arrangement would you like to have with the French? What would you say to them?
I should like to retain for ourselves Palestine, south of Haifa, apart from the enclave of Jerusalem.
وفي هذه الجلسة بالذات كأنه مارك سايكس بدأ يأخذ في الاعتبار ليس فقط الميناء والطريق الآمن إلى البصرة من الشرق المتوسط إلى البصرة، ولكن أيضا أنه التقارير المبكرة حول احتمال وجود نفط في منطقة كركوك.
It's most important that we should have a belt of English-controlled country between the Sharif of Mecca and the French in Syria.
Where do you leave the French?
I should like to draw a line from the Ian Acre to the last K in Kirkuk.
And this must all be settled before we can take military action against the Turks in Syria. We must find out what the French actually insist upon having. They demand the whole of Syria.
It cannot be merely a military proposition.
We must make terms with France. Which means we must make terms diplomatically.
Quite so.
Britain had identified the territories of the Ottoman Empire it wanted in order to protect its interests in the Suez Canal and the Arab provinces. But this plan was dependent on Britain and France winning the war, which at the start of 1915 was almost at a standstill on the Western Front in Europe. The Allies decided to open an Eastern Front against the Ottomans. The ill-fated Gallipoli campaign ran between April 1915 and January 1916. When it finally failed, the Allies, including Australians and New Zealanders, suffered a major setback. This monument commemorates the Ottoman victory, in which around 80,000 Allied troops were killed. This defeat at Gallipoli, and later in Kut in Mesopotamia, caused the British to enter into more secret deals over the Middle East. Coming up, how the British conspired with Sharif Hussein of Mecca to strike back at the Ottomans through an Arab revolt.
The British looked on the Sharifs of Mecca as the partners that were essential in the propaganda war with the Ottomans to demonstrate that the Muslim world was better off on the Allied side than fighting with the Ottomans.
Let me explain why we must have...
And Sykes and Georges Picot negotiate face-to-face to get what they both want from the Middle East.
Well, if we cannot have Palestine, my government will certainly not allow Britain to control it.
And my government would take the same view. French Palestine would be an outrage.
Well, then we need to find another solution before we come to blows.
And so, now we can draw a map.
We must retain full control.
In late 1915, early 1916, both Britain and France were exercised by how they might divide up the ailing Ottoman Empire between them, should the Allies ultimately win the First World War. But when they suffered a serious defeat at Gallipoli, Britain looked at alternative ways of attacking the Ottomans and undermining their support for Germany.
That now the Ottomans, on a victory roll, might be able to provoke uprisings in the Indian and Egyptian Muslim populations that so far they'd not been able to affect. It's at that point that Britain begins to really consider how it might turn the tables on the Ottomans and force them to fight in their own territory against an internal uprising. So, to address that challenge, they turned to the Sharifs of Mecca, who had already made overtures to the British about concluding an alliance to secure their position. Now, all of a sudden, the British looked on the Sharifs of Mecca as the partners that were essential in the propaganda war with the Ottomans to demonstrate that the Muslim world was better off on the Allied side than fighting with the Ottomans.
In 1908, the Ottomans had appointed Sharif Hussein bin Ali as the Wali, the governor of Hijaz, the area towards the Red Sea. He was from the Hashemite dynasty in Mecca, of which he was the emir. His sons Faisal and Abdullah were representatives in the Ottoman parliament, but his relationship with Istanbul had deteriorated in recent years.
بدأت أعتقد مشكلة الشريف حسين قبل الحرب العالمية الأولى، أنه القوة الصاعدة في إسطنبول 1908-1909 هي الاتحاد والترقي، والاتحاد والترقي هم أبناء النخبة العثمانية الحديثة، وهؤلاء لم يكن لديهم قدر كبير من الاحترام للقيادات التقليدية، قيادات مثل شريف مكة الذي تعود فكرة حكمه للحجاز إلى أنه هو وريث الأشراف اللي لهم قرون وهم أسسوا أمارة في الحجاز.
كانت الأغلبية الساحقة من النخب العربية في الولايات العربية للدولة العثمانية تسعى لحكم عثماني يعكس الديموغرافية العثمانية، أي حكم يعكس وجود العرب والأكراد وغيرهم. طبعا تغير هذا الوضع مع اندلاع الحرب لعدة أسباب، منها تصرفات الدولة العثمانية في البلاد العربية وخاصة حكم جمال باشا في سوريا، منها الحقيقة المحاولات الإنجليزية خاصة لاجتذاب العرب.
The Ottoman ruler of Greater Syria, Jamal Pasha, executed a group of Arabs in Damascus and Beirut in 1915 and 1916. They were accused of being separatists and of supporting the British and French. This hardened the determination of the Arab nationalists to separate from Ottoman rule and to create an independent Arab state.
Hussein didn't have any modern ideas of nationalism, but he wanted more autonomy under the Ottoman Empire, but it's only gradually that he was drawn into what became an Arab national movement, a full-scale revolt against the Ottomans. And this wasn't an easy decision for the Sharif of Mecca to make, because the Ottomans were fellow Muslims, and he was siding with an infidel power against fellow Sunni Muslims.
There had been conversations between the British and the Hashemites before the war. But in July 1915, Sharif Hussein wrote to the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon. He offered his support against the Ottomans in return for British support for an independent kingdom that would include the provinces in the Arab Peninsula and be ruled by the Hashemites.
الشريف حسين بن علي ركز على ثلاثة مسائل. المسألة الأولى هي تحديد الدولة العربية بشكل كامل بأقاليمها الرئيسية الثلاث، اللي هو إقليم الجزيرة العربية، إقليم بلاد الشام، إقليم الرافدة، بلاد الرافدة. هاي الأقاليم الأساسية المكون الأساسي للدولة العربية كاملة. المسألة الثانية هي تأكيد استقلال الدولة العربية بشكلها كامل. المسألة الثالثة كما كانت في مراسلة شريف حسين بن علي ترتيب العلاقات المستقبلية مع بريطانيا وتقديم الأفضلية لها في الشأن الاقتصادي والعسكري في المنطقة.
The correspondence continued, and McMahon wrote to Sharif Hussein on the 24th of October 1915. He said that Britain would not guarantee support for an independent Arab kingdom with all the provinces demanded by the Hashemites. Nevertheless, the Hashemites went ahead with their revolt against the Ottomans in July 1916. But many still consider McMahon's letter controversial today because of the areas the British wanted to exclude from any future Arab kingdom.
الحقيقة الذي رآه الشريف حسين هي ترجمة رديئة جدا وركيكة جدا للأفكار التي أرسلت من لندن في اللغة الإنجليزية للقاهرة والتي ترجمت هناك عند الريزيدنسي البريطانية. وبعض الأقسام السورية الواقعة في غرب دمشق وحمص وحما وحلب ولا يمكن أن يقال عنها إنها عربية محضة. كلمة الأقسام ترجمة غير صحيحة للكلمة الإنجليزية. الكلمة في اللغة الإنجليزية هي districts، أي مناطق، أقضية. يعني في عدة ترجمات ممكنة حسب شو كان بذهنهم الإنجليز، بس أظن هم كانت رغبتهم أن تبقى المسألة غامضة.
McMahon was careful not to promise anything that contravened pre-existing treaty arrangements. They wished to exclude territories to the west of Homs, Hama, and Damascus and Aleppo, and certain areas around the Gulf of Alexandretta and in Cilicia. And Britain was already in occupation of the province of Basra and much of the province of Baghdad at this time. And so Britain was very keen to declare its interest in retaining some degree of control over those territories for the mutual benefit of the Arabs and the British. Beyond those boundaries, that Britain would be willing to accept the Hashemite claim to Arab kingdom with British support.
Hussein thought that the British promised to include Palestine in his kingdom, and the British later denied that they promised him Palestine. They denied it outright, but all the evidence is that they had promised him Palestine.
طبعا إذا الواحد بيقرأ الرسائل البريطانية، رسائل سير هنري ماكماين للشريف حسين، على ضوء ما نعلمه الآن من مفاوضات الإنجليز مع الفرنسوية وعلى ضوء فهمنا للطموحات البريطانية، من الواضح أنه للإنجليز غايات عديدة في تدوين هذه الرسائل. يعني كانوا يغطوا مصالحهم وكانوا يغطوا على اللي بيعملوه مع الفرنسوية.
Significantly, in the same month that the British promised parts of Greater Syria to Sharif Hussein, they told the French that any agreement relating to the borders of an Arab kingdom would not be finalized without their consent. They knew how strong the French interest in Syria was. On the 1st of October 1915, the French ambassador to Britain, Paul Cambon, wrote to his Prime Minister, René Viviani, to tell him that London had requested a French representative to draw the borders of an Arab kingdom with Syria. In this document, the French ambassador suggested François-Georges Picot, who'd managed the general consulate in Beirut for over a year and knew the Syrian issue better than anyone else.
Alors, François-Georges Picot est un diplomate. C'est un diplomate qui est un diplomate comme on les avait à la fin du 19e siècle et au début du 20e siècle. C'est un personnage qui a ses entrées au Quai d'Orsay parce que, en fait, son père, l'ensemble de sa famille est déjà très intégré dans le système diplomatique français. Et ce sont des gens qui sont bien impliqués dans ce projet colonial asiatique et qui s'intéressent très naturellement à l'Asie. Alors, il a eu un parcours de diplomate classique, c'est-à-dire qu'il se déplace de poste en poste, et il se trouve que, par hasard, il est en Orient à Beyrouth, 1914.
Ah, Monsieur Picot.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour. Very nice to see you again. George.
The French representative, Picot, had his first meeting with the British in London on the 23rd of November, 1915.
It's delightful to see you again. I believe you know everybody else.
They started their negotiations about their respective shares of the Ottoman Empire once the war was over.
The British come along with an array of people from all the different ministries that take an interest, the War Ministry, the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, and they all are sitting on one side of the table and Picot is on the other side of the table.
Perhaps you would define for us the boundaries your government desires.
We must, of course, have the whole of Syria and Palestine.
All of it?
Of course, down to the Egyptian border.
But Monsieur Picot, you must realize there are other claims in this area.
Perhaps the Bethlehem and Jerusalem could form a kind of enclave, but certainly nowhere else.
And despite the numerical advantage, Picot just sits there with his arms crossed and says, I'm not interested in your plan. It doesn't, we can't possibly accept something along the lines that you're talking about.
Moving further east.
We must have the land north of this line and across here, including Mosul.
Mosul? The town?
No, the vilayet, the whole area around.
20 years ago, the Vilayet of Mosul included the Baghdad and Basra districts. Are you suggesting they should be separated now?
It is impossible to consider the situation of 20 years ago affecting the situation now.
So, Monsieur Picot, if you have Palestine and Syria and half Iraq and Mosul, will you be satisfied?
I think I can persuade my government.
Then we have reached an impasse.
The uncompromising positions of both sides at that first meeting caused the British Army intelligence officer in Cairo to write,
"It is obviously hopeless to attempt to arrive at any reasonable agreement with the French so long as Picot is their representative."
François-Georges Picot, c'est lui qui se retrouve en fait au commissaire en 1916-1917, au commissaire pour la Syrie et la Cilicie, et qui, parce que en fait il s'intéresse aux populations arabes, parce qu'il est plutôt anglophile, eh bien se retrouve à devoir négocier avec Mark Sykes, qui est la figure qui représente le lobby colonial britannique, et les deux hommes en fait vont être chargés d'élaborer ce qu'on appelle des buts de guerre. Et les accords Sykes-Picot sont typiquement ce qu'on appelle des buts de guerre, c'est-à-dire en cas de victoire, et seulement en cas de victoire, voilà comment on se partagera les territoires. Et il dessine en fait une carte d'un territoire qui n'existait pas et se partage en fait un monde qui est un monde quasiment désertique, c'est ce qu'on appelle les interlands, et qui vont dessiner en fait les structures des pays d'aujourd'hui.
Sir Mark, your government has been adopting extreme positions over a territory which you must recognize France has special claims to. But in the meetings I attended, no one seemed to give a centimeter. And yet, concessions, I feel, are essential. Decisions have to be made so that we both know where we stand when Turkey is conquered, as inevitably it will be.
Mr. Picot, I feel sure that within these walls, we can find a way through the issues. And my government has given me the power to make the necessary decisions.
I too have been given the freedom by my government to make the necessary decisions. And you must realize that we have very definite needs in a territory which some of my countrymen consider to be French by rights, ever since the Crusades.
Do you remember who won the Crusades?
Yes, but today the Arabs have few Saladins.
Although these talks were secret, the Russians had already made their demands.
What we must do, now that we have agreed the Russians can have the northern areas of Turkey, including the Straits,
is to discuss the southern and eastern areas so that the interests of both our great nations can be established for the decades that will follow the end of the war.
Well, let us start then with the provinces of Syria that center on Damascus and the Lebanon.
لم يكونوا يمانعوا لأن المنطقة الشمالية يعني اللي هي سوريا الكبرى أو يعني الجزء شمال حيفا من سوريا الكبرى أن تكون منطقة نفوذ فرنسي، لأنه أرادوا الفرنسيين يكونوا بفر، الفرنسيين يكونوا فاصلين بينهم وبين الروس. البريطانيين تصوروا أنه في نهاية الحرب إذا هزمت الدولة العثمانية حتكون منطقة الأناضول أو شرق الأناضول منطقة نفوذ روسي، فلم يكونوا يريدون مجاورة الروس.
So you see, it's indispensable for the Arabs of inland Syria to have some direct access to the Mediterranean, somewhere along the Syrian coast. With Lebanon in the way, under total French control, that would be impossible.
But that would mean French possessions would be split in two between the north and the south of Syria. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. Political and military administration would be impossible in such a divided territory.
Well, Monsieur Picot, I am not convinced. But let us nevertheless try to meet that objection.
My dividing line is here, from Acre to Kirkuk.
البريطانيين يريدون من ساحل المتوسط إلى البصرة منطقة آمنة، لأن هذا الطريق بديل وسريع نحو الهند، وكانوا يفكروا حتى أنه في المستقبل يبنوا خط سكة حديد توصل بين حيفا والبصرة. مسألة أخرى، البريطانيون بتوصية من تشرشل في سنة 1914، تشرشل وزير الأسطول كان في ذلك الوقت، حولوا الأسطول البريطاني من وقود الفحم إلى وقود النفط، ولأول مرة يصبح موضوع النفط موضوع استراتيجي بالبحرية البريطانية.
It will not be possible to persuade my colleagues to accept a line as far north as that. That will exclude cultivable regions like the Haran from our sphere.
I see, but for France to control territory that far south, make it very difficult for our plans for a railway line from the coast to Baghdad.
I must insist on this point, Sir Mark. And Kirkuk?
We could not possibly let you have Kirkuk. From my own travels in the area, I know that this province contains the only elements of the population which will make it possible for the colonization of Iraq.
My dear Sykes, this is hardly in a spirit of conciliation. Let me explain why we must have the territory we requested in northern Mesopotamia.
Les pourparlers entre Mark Sykes et Georges Picot vont d'emblée se poser sur la place de la Palestine dans l'ensemble. Et les Français estiment que c'est à eux de continuer à être les protecteurs des chrétiens d'Orient et que c'est à eux de continuer d'avoir la main sur Jérusalem et donc sur l'ensemble de la Palestine. Ça, c'est le point historique que les Anglais ont du mal à rediscuter. Pour les Anglais, le problème, c'est de protéger le flanc droit du canal de Suez.
So, when Sykes left the cabinet meeting on 16th of December 1915 to go and meet Picot, he had a problem because he had to reconcile two conflicting sets of demands. The set of demands that Picot was making for Syria and Lebanon, and the other set of demands that Sharif Hussein had already made and which the British had already effectively accepted, for both covering the same territory. So he and Picot came up with a map that made a distinction between two types of land in the Middle East. Land that Britain and France would absolutely control, which was coloured blue for France and red for Britain, and a hinterland, the inner region, which was called Area A and Area B, where the Arabs would have some autonomy, but in which each of the big powers, the great powers, would have the right to advise or influence.
With the further complication that the territory of what was to become Palestine was designated for an international zone where basically Russia, Britain and France, unable to agree who could lay greater claim to the Holy Lands, just deferred that decision down the road by painting it all brown.
In January 1916, the French and British agreed to ignore the borders of any future Arab kingdom. Their new borders were enshrined in the deal we now know as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes drew his line from Acre to Kirkuk, so the south of Anatolia, eastern Turkey, the Syrian coasts, and Beirut were put under direct French control. Basra and Baghdad were put under direct British control. Mosul and Damascus were put under French protection and were called Area A. The rest of Mesopotamia and the south of Greater Syria were put under British protection and called Area B. But Palestine, including Jerusalem, was designated as an international zone in brown. Although Sykes-Picot was never implemented, it formed the basis of future negotiations, and the post-Ottoman Middle East resembled the areas of influence it created.
So the map has different colours, different letters, but ultimately what really matters is the line in the sand that runs from the coast to the Persian frontier.
كان مستحيل على الإنجليز أن يسمحوا بنشر خبر اتفاقية سايكس بيكو. كانت هذه دلالة لسبب واضح، ليس فقط لإبقاء الهاشميين إلى جانب الحلفاء، إنما أيضا لتجنيد جنود عرب من الأسرى في معسكرات الاعتقال في مصر وفي الجيش العربي لا يحاربوا مع الإنجليز، ومن شان أيضا اجتذاب الشعب العربي في مناطق الدخول التي تدخل عليها القوات البريطانية.
In a funny way, the British felt that this system, that the Arabs so viewed as a betrayal, was in keeping with the terms of what they'd agreed with the Hashemites, because they were still considering the territories under informal British and French influence as kingdoms to be ruled by Arabs. And there was even one mention of the Sharifs of Mecca in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to round things out. But ultimately, for the Arabs, Sykes-Picot was double-dealing, and it seemed to be giving territory that had just been conceded to the Hashemites by the
Between November 1915 and May 1916, Britain and France agreed a secret deal for dividing the Ottoman Empire should the European allies win the First World War.
And so, now we can draw a map.
The young British politician, Sir Mark Sykes, and the French lawyer turned diplomat, François-Georges Picot, drew borders that best suited their own interests, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It cut across a separate deal the British had already made with Sharif Hussein of Mecca to support him in creating a Hashemite Arab kingdom in return for his leading an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The south of Anatolia, eastern Turkey, and the Syrian coast down to Beirut were put under direct French control, while Basra and Baghdad were placed under direct British control. Mosul and Damascus were under French protection and called Area A. The rest of Mesopotamia and the southern Levant were put under British protection and called Area B. Jerusalem was designated as an international zone. But soon after the deal was struck, some voices in London began expressing dissatisfaction with what Britain had agreed in the secret negotiations.
أحد رد الفعل جاء من كابتن هول، مسؤول استخبارات في البحرية، وهو كان شخصية نافذة. الجنرال هول كتب انتقاد حاد للاتفاقية، وفي نص انتقاد ما معناه كيف نحن نقبل بالنعطي الفرنسيين كل هذا، وفي هناك آمال وطموحات يهودية في فلسطين.
Well, if we cannot have Palestine, my government will certainly not allow Britain to control it.
And my government would take the same view.
Sykes and Picot could not agree over the future of Palestine when they did their deal at the end of 1950. And they agreed it would have an international administration. But neither side liked that as an outcome. And the British didn't like it in particular because it left the east bank of the Suez Canal exposed to an administration that could be governed by who knows who. So the British immediately started to think of a way to get round the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So in fact, Sykes almost immediately, before the ink of François-Georges Picot's signature is dry, starts talking to the Zionists.
The Zionist movement grew up in the late 19th century with the ultimate aim of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Jewish lobby was growing in Britain, and the British government took its aims seriously. The British might also use support for the Jews to persuade the American government, which included several Jewish figures, to join the war. Other factors may also have been at play.
The Zionist movement itself and its leader, Chaim Weizmann, were political Zionists, and their aim from the very beginning, the ultimate aim, was an independent Jewish state in Palestine. So in these early days, they didn't say that because it had only evoked hostility to their project.
هيك بدأت الفكرة تنضج. لو إحنا وجدنا طريقة نقنع الفرنسيين بطموحات وآمال اليهود في فلسطين، وأنه جعلنا اليهود يقولون أنه إحنا نريد أن يكون لنا تواجد في فلسطين تحت الإشراف البريطاني، فمعنى ذلك أنه إحنا بدال ما يكون لنا جزء صغير في فلسطين أن نأخذ كل فلسطين من الفرنسيين ونتخلص من التزاماتنا في سايكس بيكو. لدرجة بعض المؤرخين يقولون لو لم توجد الحركة الصهيونية لاخترعت بريطانيا الحركة الصهيونية.
On the 2nd of November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Arthur Balfour, wrote to the leading Jewish figure, Walter Rothschild, to say that his government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this project. A month before the Balfour Declaration, the new Bolshevik government in Russia, following the revolution, had made public the details of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it sought to distance itself from decisions made by its Tsarist predecessors.
روسيا بعد الثورة فضحت تلك الاتفاقات لأن الثورة كانت معادية للإمبريالية، معادية للرأسمالية، وطبعا روسيا فضحت تلك الاتفاقات لأن رأت في تلك الاتفاقات الانتهاك السافر لحقوق الشعوب للشرق الأوسط وكأداة لاستغلال واستعمار تلك الشعوب.
The revelation from the Russians came while the Hashemites were fighting alongside the British in the Levant, so they realized the British were playing a double game. The British also recognized France's right to determine the future of large parts of the area that Sharif Hussein had expected to control.
خلال 1917 و 1918 الأشراف عرفوا بالتأكيد إنهم لن يحصلوا على حكم عربي في كل العراق وكل بلاد الشام والحجاز خالصا لهم.
فيما بعد باشرت القيادة البريطانية لإرسال عدة رسائل إلى الشريف حسين بن علي والابن فيصل. الرسائل كانت هي عبارة عن تطمينات إنه هذه الاتفاقية هي لترتيب الأمور في المستقبل وعملية تنمية المناطق، وهي فقط لتوزيع المصالح، لكن لا يمكن نهائيا التنازل عن مبدأ السيادة العربية والدولة العربية وغير ذلك. على الرغم من كل ذلك هذا لم يقنع العرب، لكن في نفس الوقت هم مجبرون على أن يواصلوا مسيرتهم للوصول للهدف النهائي طالما أنهم قطعوا شوط طويل ولا فائدة من العودة إلى الجانب التركي والألماني بأي شكل من الأشكال.
In 1917, the Allies made significant military gains on several fronts. The British pushed into Iraq, and General Edmund Allenby led the forces that ultimately ousted the Ottomans from Palestine. But Allenby's continued advance towards Damascus caused the French serious alarm. They had expected to have complete control of the Levant under the terms of the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
La Grande Guerre change complètement la donne parce que, en raison de la campagne menée par le général Allenby, et la situation militaire a inversé complètement les rôles. Ce sont les Anglais qui, désormais, ont le leadership. Les Français sont tout à fait minoritaires en termes de troupes, mais il y a cet accord de 1916, l'accord Sykes-Picot, qui permet aux Français de dire « Vous, Anglais, vous avez déterminé un territoire, laissez-nous le prendre ».
Allenby and the Hashemites took the Syrian capital on the 30th of September 1918, and within a week, Prince Faisal bin al-Hussein had announced the establishment of an Arab constitutional government in Damascus.
أصبح في هناك توجه قوي حول يعني إلغاء سايكس بيكو، التخلي عن سايكس بيكو ومحاولة إيجاد صيغة أكثر إرضاء وصيغة تتناسب مع الجهد الذي قام به البريطانيون في الشرق الأوسط.
The First World War ended in stages, with the Ottomans agreeing an armistice on the 30th of October and Germany on the 11th of November 1918. Allied troops entered Istanbul, and the time appeared right to implement the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But the British appeared to be having second thoughts, as they sought to claim a larger share of Ottoman Arab territory in the region. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, met his French counterpart, Georges Clemenceau, in London on the 4th of December 1918.
So, it is over. Europe is safe. But the sacrifices were great.
And France, Prime Minister, sacrificed more, perhaps, than any of us.
As the Ottoman Empire no more. But that was due to your sacrifices, Monsieur the Prime Minister, and for those we are most grateful.
You will take some tea?
Mais oui, merci. Now, we will have to settle our claims on the area at the peace talks.
We have fought a little over those claims. You would like perhaps that we modify ours?
We had our eye on Mosul.
You shall have it. And perhaps something else.
Palestine?
You shall have that too.
الفرنسيين كانوا يريدوا يفرضوا شروط قاسية على الألمان، ويأخذوا من الألمان يعني جزء من المناطق المتنازع عليها، وكانوا يريدوا الدعم البريطاني في مؤتمر الصلح. في المقابل كليمنسو تساهل فيما يتعلق بفلسطين، لكن فيما يتعلق في الموصل قدم تنازل. بهذه الجلسة تقريبا أصبح واضح أنه سايكس بيكو انتهت.
The signs of the Sykes-Picot Agreement being superseded began to emerge at the start of the peace negotiations in Paris in January 1919. The victorious Allies were about to impose harsh conditions on the vanquished, and the British and French to decide which of the conflicting promises they had made during the war would be implemented.
Et donc, à partir de ce moment-là, vous avez une négociation complexe avec des hauts et des bas, des retournements, des scènes dramatiques, parce que on est dans la comédie diplomatique où chacun joue son jeu, qui va durer en fait de décembre 1918 à avril 1920, avec des inflexions considérables.
ساد على الأقل بين الإنجليز وبين الفرنسيين تفاهم بأنه بعد أن انهزموا الحلفاء ألمانيا كان من الضروري إبقاء هذا الحلف بشكل متين وقوي لمواجهة عودة ألمانيا كقوة عظمى. فكانوا يختلفوا وبعدين يرجعوا ليقولوا والله بس الحاجة أكبر لأن نبقى مع سوا لمواجهة ألمانيا.
In April 1920, the four main allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, met at the San Remo Conference. They created three entities: Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. The French forced Faisal out of Damascus and took complete control of Syria. Britain took Mesopotamia and Palestine, including Jerusalem, which had been under international administration under the terms of Sykes-Picot.
So really it's San Remo we should be talking about if we want to say, what does the modern Middle East look like? And the striking thing is this: if Britain had been concerned to preserve relations with France right through this negotiation, right through this process, they failed. Because the French looked at Sykes-Picot and they looked at the map of San Remo, and they realized that they got much less in San Remo than they had been promised by the British in Sykes-Picot. We overlook these things, but in a sense, I think that Sykes-Picot reflects a failure of trying to negotiate a happy resolution of British and French territorial ambitions in the Middle East. Britain came out with more, and the French never forgave them.
France had insisted on Mosul in the Sykes-Picot negotiations, but at San Remo, they conceded it to Britain despite the fact that it was known to be rich in oil.
Or, ils découvrent très rapidement que même si les ressources de pétrole que les Français recherchent sont dans le vilayet de Mossoul, ce sont les Anglais présents dans la Turkish Petroleum Company qui ont les concessions, et pas les Français. Donc les Français risquent d'avoir le territoire sans les concessions. Et les Anglais ont les concessions, mais ils n'ont pas le territoire.
France got a bit more territory in the south, along the southern edges of what would become the Iraq-Syria boundary. It got more there. It got 25% of any oil that would be produced from Mosul, even though that was going to now be developed as a British concern.
On the international stage, the League of Nations now created a series of mandates. It placed some new Arab territories under the supervision of the British and French, a kind of occupation in disguise.
L'article 22 de la Charte de la Société des Nations qui définit les mandats. Et les mandats sont définis de façon contradictoire. Parce que dans l'article 22, on dit que les mandats sont une tutelle, mais on dit que ce sont un conseil. Si c'est une tutelle, la puissance mandataire contrôle étroitement les actions de leur pupille. Si c'est un conseil, la puissance mandataire ne fait que conseiller et non pas ordonner.
The British and the French did overcome their differences in their carve-up of the Middle East and agreed on concrete borders in December 1920. A joint French-British committee was set up to deal with the matter.
رسم الحدود ما بين العراق وسوريا وما بين لبنان وفلسطين هو أن الضباط الفرنسيين والضباط الإنجليز كانوا يمشوا على طرفين ما أصبحت فيما بعد الحدود من قرية إلى قرية من منطقة إلى منطقة وقالوا هذا إلكم هذا إلنا عملية.
As well as dividing up the region into 3 new entities and implementing the mandate system, Britain and France further split the territories they now controlled. The French divided Syria into 5 states, including Greater Lebanon.
مجرد سيطرة الفرنسيين على سوريا قاموا في البداية بتوسيع متصرفي جبل لبنان العثمانية بأخذ مناطق قطاعات من بقية الألوية السورية لولاية دمشق ولولاية صيدا وصنعوا لبنان كما نعرفه الآن.
Syria was divided into the states of Damascus, Aleppo, the Alawite state, and Mount Druze. Lebanon would become a republic 6 years later.
في دمشق كان تيار توحيدي انه لا تكون دعوا سوريا على ما هي ولا تقسموها وكان هناك تيارات انفصاليه ايضا فكان على الفرنسي ان يوازن بين الامرين لانه ماذا يريد الفرنسي؟ هل يهم الفرنسي ان يقسم او يوحد؟ لا ما يهمه هو ان تستمر سيطرته.
The British Colonial Office organized the Cairo Conference in 1921, hosted by the new Colonial Secretary, Winston Churchill. It drew another important line within the British area of influence, separating the land east of the River Jordan from Palestine.
Churchill came to this brief without any pre-existing ideas on the future of the Middle East. He was, in a sense, moving as quickly as events were to try and put in place administrative structures that could prove effective in securing Britain's interest, at least cost to the exchequer.
I mean, there had been some proposals, which particularly from the Zionist organization, which were pushing for a Palestine being defined in much more extensive terms to include the east bank of the Jordan as well. But in the end, Jordan and Palestine ended up being under the same British mandate, as you know, at the end of the First World War. And then we simply had an order in council that established, if you like, its first main border in 1922.
When the Hashemites failed in their bid to establish an independent Arab kingdom, the Cairo Conference created Transjordan, with Sharif Hussein's elder son, Abdullah, as emir. Iraq was created in Mesopotamia with Hussein's younger son Faisal as king. Faisal had been a commander in the Arab revolt and was the deposed king of Syria.
If we look at Iraq's territorial definition today, there were zones envisaged in Sykes-Picot that cut across it. But the actual boundaries to be drawn, I suppose, for Iraq after Sykes-Picot, the first one would have been shortly after Iraq had been created in 1920, was the Anglo-French Convention of December 1920.
In Istanbul, capital of the former Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk successfully resisted foreign attempts to divide the Turkish-speaking lands. He led the Turkish War of Independence and repelled the Greeks, Italians, French, and Armenians. Atatürk united the country, and the new Turkish Republic was proclaimed in October 1923.
Mais globalement, les frontières vont s'installer. Elles vont s'installer progressivement, tout simplement à cause des événements politiques. Quand la Syrie entre en révolution contre les Français en 1926, on voit immédiatement la différence entre la Syrie, la Palestine et la Transjordanie. Quand les Palestiniens se révoltent en 1937, on voit la différence entre la Palestine, la Syrie et le Liban. D'un côté, vous êtes dans une région en guerre, de l'autre côté, vous êtes dans une région en paix.
The Syrian Revolution in 1936 finally brought about a French exit and unified the country. By the end of 1946, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria had all gained independence. British and French forces left, but now there are sometimes differing views as to whether the borders the two powers drew were really the root cause of the problems the Arab world has experienced since.
It's very hard to blame regional problems in the 20th century on the ways in which the borders were drawn. The most you can say, if there is an original sin to Sykes-Picot, it's that those borders were drawn without consulting the people who'd have to live within them, and for never securing the buy-in of those who'd be most directly involved. The borders were themselves to prove unstable.
التقسيم هذا أقام دول على ما يسمى بفكرة النيشن ستيت، يعني الدولة القومية بالمفهوم الأوروبي الغربي، ولكنه لم يضع حلا للمسألة القومية في المنطقة. حول المسألة القومية من أن هي مجرد يعني إطار لتعددية وتنوع ثقافي في الفضاء العثماني، حولها إلى أداة وأرضية لصراعات دموية.
منطقتنا أهم منطقة استراتيجية في العالم، كانت ولا تزال. اسكندر، المغول، الرومان، لا نابليون. منطقتنا مهمة جدا استراتيجيا للذي يريد أن يسيطر على البحر الأبيض المتوسط وعلى العالم. إذن مستهدفين شئنا أبينا، هذا أولا. ثانيا، منطقتنا تحتوي على الكثير من نفط العالم.
In part 2, we'll ask whether the superpowers of the 21st century have ignored lessons in the wake of Sykes-Picot and sought to create yet more division and boundaries in the Middle East than ever before. The League of Nations' mandate for Palestine came into effect in September 1923. It stated that the Allied powers had agreed that the mandate be responsible for establishing, quote, a national home for the Jewish people.
كرست بريطانيا جهدها السياسي والعسكري وحتى المؤسسي أو الإداري من أجل توفير إمكانية إقامة دولة أو على الأقل وطن يهودي بفلسطين. فمنحت مثلا تشكيل الوكالة اليهودية كجسم تمثيلي لليهود بفلسطين، وأيضا مكنت الهجرة اليهودية إلى فلسطين من أوروبا، من روسيا ومناطق أخرى.
I think that Zionist diplomacy was brilliant in a way manipulating British philo and anti-Semitic feelings at the same time, because this fantasy of presenting the Jews in America as the key to whether or not America would participate in the war, and by presenting, exaggerating the power of the Jews worldwide.
In the coming years, Palestinians would fight several campaigns, from demanding independence from Britain to trying to stem the tide of Jewish immigration to Palestine. The movement culminated in the revolt of 1936, which took the form of strikes and armed resistance.
انتهت الثورة العربية الكبرى عام 39 مع نشر ما سمي عليه بالكتاب الأبيض البريطاني، واللي طرح أن تقوم حكومة عربية على فلسطين بعد 10 سنوات، وأن تقوم على كل أراضي فلسطين مع السماح لاستمرار الهجرة اليهودية إلى فلسطين لمدة 5 سنوات قادمة. القيادة العربية آنذاك يعني بقيادة الحج أمين حسيني عارضت الكتاب الأبيض البريطاني تماما، والذي أيضا عارض الكتاب الأبيض طبعا الحركة الصهيونية بكل أطيافها، واعتبرت أنه الكتاب الأبيض البريطاني يمثل أكبر تهديد ممكن للحركة الصهيونية.
And the British crushed this revolt. The Zionists weren't strong enough at that time. They didn't have the military capability. The British brutally put down the Arab revolt, and it's arguable, and I would argue, that Palestine wasn't lost in 1947-48. It was lost in the late 1930s when Britain put down so firmly the Arab revolt and destroyed all Palestinian military capability.
The British mandate in Palestine ended on the 14th of May 1948. As it ended, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of a Jewish state to be known as Israel. The same day, the armies of 5 Arab states moved into the former British mandate. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War lasted almost a year, the first of several subsequent major border conflicts. Israeli settlements beyond its recognized borders have also continued Israel's expansion.
الجماعات الأكثر تطرفاً عقائدياً كانوا يتطلعوا إلى توسيع حدود إسرائيل لتشمل ما اعتبروه أراضي مملكة إسرائيل التاريخية، والتي تشمل ما نعرفه اليوم بالأردن، يعني شرق نهر الأردن. لكن يعني حسم هذا الصراع فعلياً بال48 بغلبة الحركة حزب العمال الإسرائيلي، ويعني كان هناك اتفاق ضمني في داخل إسرائيل بأنه لن يكتمل المشروع الصهيوني حتى حسب نظر المعتدلين يعني حزب العمال سوى عند بلوغ حدود نهر الأردن، واكتمل ذلك طبعا إثر حرب عام 67.
The balance of power has remained in Israel's favor. In 1967, it expanded its borders in the Six-Day War to include the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights.
يوجد حوالي 500 إلى 600 ألف مستوطن إسرائيلي يهودي في داخل أراضي يفترض أن تتبع للسيادة الفلسطينية مستقبلا، وهذا كان القصد من استيطان مناطق معينة في داخل الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية بشكل خاص من قبل بعض الجماعات الإسرائيلية التي أرادت أن تجعل من المستحيل إقامة دولة فلسطينية بالضفة والقطاع، وبالتالي ربما أن المجتمع الدولي مضطر إلى الإقرار بواقع جديد، وهو أن لا مجال لدولتين، دولة فلسطينية ودولة إسرائيلية.
Those people in Israel today, like President Rivlin, who call for a binational state, they insist on civil rights for the Palestinians, human rights for the Palestinians, equality for the Palestinians in terms of economic, social, and cultural issues, etc., but not political. That is, this will remain the state where Jews would have the upper hand, politically speaking. And that binational state would be open to Jewish immigration, but not to Palestinian immigration. And what kind of a state is it going to be? It is going to be, as I say, the South African state without a South African solution.
Like Palestine, Iraq has also been affected by the legacy of Sykes-Picot. In 2003, a US-led coalition declared war on Iraq, believing it to possess weapons of mass destruction and aiming to oust President Saddam Hussein. However, the coalition didn't have a clear recovery plan for a post-Saddam Iraq, and sectarian and ethnic unrest seriously destabilized the country.
You go back to Baghdad prior to the invasion of other areas. They were intermingled. People lived, Shia and Sunni lived in the same areas. There were intermarriages. In fact, in the early years of the invasion, the Iraqis insisted there'd never be a conflict. They were too closely integrated. But the sledgehammer that smashed the society and the atrocities and so on that should be well known did manage to instigate a conflict. Once a conflict starts, there's a predictable cycle of violence that takes place.
I come, I think, primarily with three main objectives. The first is to support the administrator, Ambassador Jerry Bremer, in what he is doing in this transitional period for Iraq.
If you look at the history of modern Iraq since 2003, you might say that no leader has come through who's been able to settle Iraq and govern with the consent of enough of the majority to bring Iraq to a stable condition and to political security.
أنا ذهبت إلى العراق بعد الحرب فورا من قبل الأمم المتحدة ورأيت جاري بريمر يصافح العراقيين واحد واحد، أنت شيعي ولا سني؟ وكنت أرى الهجوم والاستغراب على وجوه العراقيين. لماذا؟ لأنه في بغداد وحدها كان هناك أكثر من 1 مليون عائلة تقوم على التزاوج بين الشيعة والسنة. فيبدأ الرجل والله أنا أبوي سني بس أمي شيعية، لا يستمع إليه بريمر إنه لا تهمني إذا لم تكن واضح.
لم يبدأ حقيقة الأمر من تأسيس مجلس الحكم، وإنما يعود إلى سنوات المعارضة في الخارج. الإدارة الأمريكية كانت تستدعي ممثلي المكونات الاجتماعية العراقية. هي لم تدعو العراقيين باعتبار أن بينهم جامع وطني اسمه العراق أو الهوية العراقية، وإنما دعت الأكراد باعتبارهم أكراد، ودعت العرب الشيعة باعتبارهم شيعة، ودعت التركمان باعتبارهم تركمان، وهكذا.
Iraqi resistance to the US occupation increased, as did sectarian killings. The country fell deeper into chaos, causing some Americans to call for the division of Iraq. It was almost as though they hadn't studied the lessons of the post-Sykes-Picot periods.
خيار التقسيم سوف يلحق الضرر بالشعب العراقي أولا. نحن لا سامح الله إذا أعلن التقسيم فنتوقع هجرة متبادلة على نطاق واسع، ربما مذابح وقتول أيضا متبادلة لا حصر لها، وبعد ذلك سوف تمضي عشرات السنين حتى تستقر هذه الكيانات الجديدة إذا استقرت.
الدعوة إلى التطهير العرقي أو المذهبي أو الطائفي بحيث تقوم دول ذات لون واحد هي مجرد مشاريع مصطنعة ضد الطبيعة.
Sunni leaders in Iraq began to warn against the intervention of neighboring Shia Iran in the internal affairs of their country. They feared a sectarian war which would lead the country into a spiral of violence and arguably make division the only option.
العراق لم يكن في يوم من الأيام معاديا لإيران، وإنما كانت إيران معادية للعراق وهي تفصح عن نواياها، ودائما تروج أن العراق كان في يوم من الأيام هو جزء من الإمبراطورية الساسانية وينبغي أن يعود لأحضان هذه الإمبراطورية، وهذا الذي حصل. زرع الفتنة الطائفية، تحقيق الانقسام المجتمعي بين الشيعة والسنة، فوجود كيانات ضعيفة سوف يغري دول الجوار من أجل التمدد والاستحواذ على هذه الكيانات الجديدة.
اهمیت عراق از نظر سیاسی برای ما وقتی میخوام عرضه بکنیم باید به 8 سال جنگ تحمیلی. ببینید 8 سال جنگ تحمیلی چه بلایی سر مملکت ما آورد. پس عراق به همون اندازه مهمه، ثبات و اینکه یک حکومت مردم سالار که دو مرتبه وسیله و بازی قدرت‌های منطقه‌ای یا بین‌المللی قرار نگیره برای ضربه زدن به ما، به این دلیل مهمه. پس اهمیت عراق، اهمیت دموکراسی در عراق، اهمیت توفیق این دموکراسی در عراق، دموکراسی نیپن برای ما به اندازه لطمی هستش که از صدام.
The Kurds managed to achieve autonomy in the Kurdistan region of Iraq in 2005. Their political leadership is now pushing for a referendum on independence, which could mean drawing new borders within Iraq.
And it is true that the Iraqi Kurds are quite happy up in Salamania and where they are in their own enclave, as it were. But the United States continues to look for an Iraq which is integrous and not divided into three.
اتفاقية لوزان وساكس بيكو لم تراعي مصالح الأخوة الكرد، وبالتالي تجد اليوم الكرد مقسمين على تقريبا 4 دول أو أكثر، ومن حق الشعب الكردي أن تكون له دولة في نهاية المطاف. لكن في الوقت الحاضر أي حقيقة الأمر، أي زعزعة في خارطة ساكس بيكو سيكون خيارا تدميريا للمنطقة بكاملها.
The threat of division has also emerged in modern Syria. The Syrian revolution began in March 2011. The government of President Bashar al-Assad responded by waging a fierce war against all opposition, with far-reaching consequences. It represents a major challenge facing the international community in 2016. The situation in Syria was exacerbated by the intervention of both Russia and Iran and their support for the Assad government against the rebels.
وقت النظام واجه أزمة عميقة بعد اغتيال الحريري وحوصر أيضا، الإيرانيين انتبهوا أنه في فرصة أنه يأخذوا النظام السوري ويأخذوا سوريا من خلاله، وإجا أحمدي نجاد عمل زيارة خاصة وعمل اتفاق استراتيجي مع الأسد للدفاع عنه للتفاهم معه. دخلوا الإيرانيين كما لو كانت سوريا إلهم وعم يدافعوا عنها على أساس أنه هي اليوم منطقة نفوذ مكرسي.
ما هیچ حرکت ضد مردم سوریه را حتما پشتیبانی نمی‌کنیم. همونطور که گفتم ما اجازه نداریم دخالت کنیم در امور داخلی دیگر ملت‌ها. این قانون اساسی ماست. ما به این قسم می‌خوریم در این مجلس و رئیس جمهور هم میاد بعد از اینکه نمایندگان قسم می‌خورن به این، خود رئیس جمهور هم به این قانون اساسی قسم می‌خوره که اینو اجرا کنه. اونی که ما کمک سوریه می‌کنیم مقابله با حضور خارجی‌ها و تروریست هاست در سوریه، کسانی که می‌خوان سوریه رو ببرن به طرف تقسیم.
The UN stopped publishing the death toll in Syria in 2014, and the numbers are now thought to be much higher than official figures. When Russia entered the conflict on the side of the Assad government in September 2015, it began bombing opposition-held areas and has become a major player in the ongoing crisis.
الروس يعتبرون الحق أنهم أنشأوا الجيش العربي السوري قبل أن يلد مش بشار الأسد، قبل أن يلد حافظ الأسد. يعني أنهم استولدوا سوريا الحديثة عسكريا وصناعيا.
في رأيي لا يمكن أن نحكم على المصلحة الروسية في سوريا بأنها المصلحة المتعلقة بالنفوذ. عندما بدأ الرئيس بوش مزاولة سياسة مثلا الإطاحة بالأنظمة أو مثلا نشر الديمقراطية والتدخل العسكري المباشر الأحادي الجانب، ونحن بذلك ندافع عن الشرعية الدولية وحق للدولة في مزاولة سياساتها المستقلة.
A Russian intervention which is to guard Russian interests in their oldest Arab ally, that Russian intervention makes Russia a stakeholder. So has to be brought into the talking that needs to proceed, as does Iran with Hezbollah as a proxy in Syria, and as does the European interest in the form of the flow of refugees from Syria out into Europe, the interest of the Europeans in a stable Near East and Middle East, and America in that role also of global stability, with a particular interest on top of that in the security of Israel.
The international community is still trying to bring the parties together to find a solution to the Syrian crisis.
But we don't want to divide this thing up.
Dividing the country is part of the debate.
Whatever. And it's up to the Syrians. I mean, the Syrians...
Now, on the question of whether the country will be dissolved or not, or divided or not, it seems to me that it is already divided in a very real way, with the Alawites and the Christians and the other Shias occupying a certain amount of territory and the Sunni majority occupying the others. And I'm not very hopeful that Syria would be able to be put back together again.
هذا التقسيم موجود، وعندما نشترك في محاربة داعش نحن في نفس الوقت نتحارب مع خطر تقسيم سوريا، أو مثلا خطر استيلاء داعش على ما يبقى وما تبقى من الأرض السورية.
أنا باعتقادي أنه هي جزء من الضغط على السوريين مشان أنه يقبلوا بالحلول اللي عم يطرحوها الروس والغربيين اليوم، اللي هي إما بتقبلوا أنه مؤسسات الدولة القائمة تستمر مع بعض التعديلات، أو أنه البلد حتنقسم لأنه ما حيكون في إمكانية للحل.
The conflict in Syria has become increasingly sectarian. It has caused the internal displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, and the international exodus of refugees on an unprecedented scale in the modern world. Some think that a form of federation is the only solution.
يعني إذا كسرنا اليوم دول سايكس بيكو، عملنا من كل دولة 10 دول، حيصير عند هالدول حظوظ أكثر إنه تخلق جامعة تكنولوجية وتخلق مراكز أبحاث اليوم كبيرة تحسن تطور تبدع وتبتكر وتدخل بالمشاركة مع الحضارة. لا، بدها تكون متسوية على الدول.
وأنا لا خوف عندي على الإطلاق من الفيدرالية. الفيدرالية مخيفة عندما تأتي لتحل مكان ما هو موحد. إذا عندك دولة موحدة وإذا طرف قال أنا بدي فيدرالية، تقول هذا يمكن مدخل التقسيم أو انفصال أو كذا. لكن عندما تكون دولة متشظية، الفيدرالية قد تكون وسيلة للتوحد، التوحد بالحد الأدنى لكن للتوحد. فلا يعني لا يجب أن يكون لدينا وهم أن الدولة القوية هي يجب أن تكون دولة موحدة، وإلا ما كانت أمريكا حكمت العالم، يعني هي دولة فيدرالية كمان.
I think that an Assad that controls the country might suit better the interest of Israel, because he will be sort of the legitimized ruler after such a civil war, after such a carnage. The worst scenario is the disintegration of the country into uncontrollable fiefdoms, as it were. No, so I think that one Syria complete, with a regime that is not particularly legitimate in the eyes of the international community, is something that would suit, I think, the current rulers of Israel.
The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, has also complicated the situation in Syria and has proclaimed the creation of a state in parts of Syria and Iraq. While American planes were bombing ISIL in Syria, they also enabled Kurdish groups to take control of certain areas of northern Syria in October 2015 and proclaim a Kurdish province there. This could be seen as encouraging the idea of a federal division of Syria, as well as causing alarm bells for neighboring countries.
In Syria, they are trying to get some kind of cantons with the help of Russia, United States, and Assad and Iranian regime. And a canton like Hezbollah style in Lebanon, a de facto habitat where internationally they may not be recognized, but de facto they would operate over there and continue to attack Turkey or create kinds of problems in the region.
In mid-2015, there were armed clashes in Turkey between the government of Recep Erdogan and the PKK. The Kurdish PKK, founded in 1978, wants a political entity of its own, independent of Ankara.
إن حزب العمال الكردستان الآن يستمر في انتفاضته وله شرطان في إنهاء الانتفاضة. أحدهما أن تعترف الدولة التركية باللغة الكردية وتجعلها لغة حكومية، لغة رسمية في المدارس. والثاني إعطاء الحق الحكم الذاتي بدون أن يتحقق هذان الشرطان. لا يمكن أن يوقف هذا الحزب العمال الكردستاني هذه الانتفاضة.
Mother tongue language as being an official language in schools is a legitimate demand, and it could be expressed in the democratic society. So I don't see any legitimate and logical demand for any kind of autonomy. Even if it was there, it is going to be PKK's demand. And we are not in place to debate or negotiate that kind of autonomy with PKK on the behalf of all Kurds or Turks.
The ultimate legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement was to establish the right of outside powers and interests to intervene and influence the politics of the Middle East. The sense of instability and constant conflict it has engendered seems even more complex to address now than it was 100 years ago.